not because I have anything strange to relate, anything new to tell, are these words written. For the other reason, rather, that I was a child as other children, that my memories are their memories, as my hopes were their hopes, my dreams their dreams, my fears their fears. I open the book of memory to tear out some pages for you others. There is nothing here that is not in my most clear and vivid recollection. When I was a little child, I used to pray fervently, tearfully, that when I should be grown up, I might never forget what I thought and felt and suffered then. Let these pages speak for me, and bear witness that I have not forgotten. Part 1. Stuart Plaid. When I was small and teachable, my mother was compelled to much travel and change of scene by the illness of my elder sister, and, as she liked to have me more or less within reach, I changed schools as a place-hunter changes his politics. The first school I went to was a Mrs. Arthur's at Brighton. I remember very little about the lessons, because I was only 7 years old, but I remember, to my inmost fibre I remember the play. There was a yard behind the house, no garden, and there I used to play with another small child whose name I have forgotten, but I know that she wore a Stuart plaid frock, and that I detested her. On the first day of my arrival, we were sent into the playground with our toys. Stuart Plaid, as I must call her, having no other name, had a battered doll and 3 scallop shells. I had a very complete little set of pewter tea things in a cardboard box. "Let's change for a bit," said Stuart Plaid. Mingled politeness and shyness compelled my acquiescence. She took my new tea things, and I disconsolately nursed the battered torso of her doll. But this grew very wearisome, and I, feeling that the claims of courtesy had been fully met, protested mildly. "Now then," said Stuart Plaid, looking up from the tea things, "don't be so selfish. Besides, they're horrid, stupid little tin things. I wouldn't give 2p for them." "But I don't want you to give 2p for them. I want them back." "Oh, no, you don't." "Yes, I do," said I, roused by her deprecation of my property, "and I'll have them too, so there." I advanced towards her, I am afraid with some half-formed determination of pulling her hair. "All right," she said, "you stand there and I'll put them in the box and give them to you." "Promise?" "Yes, if you don't move." She turned her back on me. It took her a very long time to put them in the box. I stood tingling with indignation and a growing desire to slap her face. Presently she turned. "You would have them back," she said, grinning unpleasantly, "and here they are." She put them into my hands. She had bitten every single cup, saucer, and plate into a formless lump. While I stood speechless with anger and misery, she came close to me and said tauntingly, "There now, aren't you sorry you didn't let me have them?" "I'll go home," I said, struggling between pride and tears. "Oh, no, you won't," said Stuart Plaid, thrusting her mocking face close to mine. "And if you say a word about it, I'll say you did it, and pinched me as well, and Mrs. Arthur'll believe me, because I'm not a new girl, and you are." I turned away without a word, and I never did tell, till now. But I never said another word to Stuart Plaid out of school. She tortured me unremittingly. When I had been at school a week or two, my paint-box suffered at her hands, but I bore it meekly and in silence, only seeking to replace my Vandyke brown by mud from the garden. Chinese white I sought to manufacture by a mixture of chalk picked up on the seashore and milk from my mug at tea time. It was never a successful industry. I remember the hot white streets, and the flies, and Brill's baths, and the Western Road, and the bitter pang of passing, at the end of a long procession, our own house, where always someone might be at the window, and never anyone was. I used to go home on Saturdays, and then all bitterness was so swallowed up in the bliss of the home returning that I actually forgot the miseries of my school life, but I was very unhappy there. Mrs. Arthur and the big girls were kind enough to me, but Stuart Plaid was enough to blight any lot. She blighted mine, and I suppose no prisoner ever hailed the falling of his fetters with the joy I felt when, at last, after 3 or 4 days of headache and tears, I was wrapped in a blanket and taken home with the measles. When I got better, we went for the midsummer holidays to a lovely cottage among the beech woods of Buckinghamshire. I shall never forget the sense of rest and delight that filled my small heart when I slipped out under the rustic porch at 5 o'clock the first morning and felt the cool velvet turf under my feet. Brighton pavement had been so hard and hot. Then, instead of the long rows of dazzling houses with their bow windows and green-painted balconies, there were lovely trees, acacias and elms, and a big copper beech. In the school walks we had never found any flowers but little pink bindweed by the dusty roadside. Here there were royal red roses and jasmine and tall white lilies, and in the hedge by the gate, sweetbriar and deep-cupped white Alfred had a rabbit volvulus. I think I saw then, for the first time, how lovely God's good world is, and ever since then, thank God, I have been seeing it more and more. That was a happy morning. The boys, whom I had not seen for ever so long because of the measles, were up already. Alfred had a rabbit for me, a white rabbit with pink eyes, in a hutch he had made himself. And Harry led me to a nook among the roots of the copper beech, where he showed me 2 dormice in an old tea-caddy. "You shall go shares in them if you like," he said. There was honey in the comb for breakfast, and new-laid eggs, and my mother was there in a cool cotton gown pouring out tea, and purring with pleasure at having all her kittens together again. There were cool raspberries on the table too, trimmed with fresh green leaves, and through the window and its promise. That was summer indeed. After breakfast my mother called me to her. She had some patterns in her hand. "You must be measured for some new frocks, Daisy," she said. "Oh, how nice! What colour?" "Well, some nice white ones, and this pretty plaid." She held up a pattern as she spoke. It was a Stuart plaid. "Oh, not that!" I cried. "Not this pretty plaid, darling? Why not?" If you'll believe me, I could not say why not. And the frock was made, and I wore it, loathing it, till the day when I fell out of the apple tree, and it broke my fall by catching on a branch. But it saved my life at the expense of its own, and I gave a feast to all the dolls to celebrate its interment in the rag bag. I have often wondered what it is that keeps children from telling their mothers these things, and even now I don't know. I only know I might have been saved many of these little big troubles if I had only been able to explain. But I wasn't, and to this day my mother does not know how and why I hated that Stuart plaid frock. End of Part 1. Part 2. Long Division. I spent a year in the select boarding establishment for young ladies and gentlemen at Stamford, and I venture to think I should have preferred a penal settlement. Miss Fairfield, whose school it was tall and pale and dark, and I thought her as good and beautiful as an angel. I don't know now whether she was really beautiful, but I know she was good. And her mother, dear soul, had a sympathy with small folly and disgrace, which has written her name in gold letters on my heart. But there was another person in the house, whose name I will not put down. She came continually between me and my adored Miss Fairfield. She had a sort of influence over me, which made it impossible for me ever to do anything well while she was near me. Miss Fairfield's health compelled her to leave much to Miss and I was, in consequence, as gloomy a cynic as any child of my age in Lincolnshire. My chief troubles were three: my hair, my hands, and my arithmetic. My hair was never tidy. I don't know why. Perhaps it runs in the family, for my little daughter's head is just as rough as mine used to be. This got me into continual disgrace. I am sure I tried hard enough to keep it tidy. I brushed it for fruitless hours, till my little head was so sore that it hurt me to put my hat on. But it would never look smooth and shiny like Katie Martin's, nor would it curl prettily like the red locks of Cissy Thomas. It was always a rough, impossible brown mop. I got into a terrible scrape for trying to soften it by an invention of my own. As we all know, Burley House is by Stamford town, and in Burley Park we children took our daily constitutional. We played under the big oaks there, and were bored to extinction, not because we disliked the park, but because we went there every day at the same hour. Now, Harry Martin, he wore striped stockings and was always losing his handkerchief, suffered from his hair almost as much as I did. So when I unfolded my plan to him one day in the park, he joyfully agreed to help me. We each gathered a pocket full of acorns, and when we went to wash our hands before dinner, we cut up some of the acorns into little bits, and put them into the doll's bath with some cold water and a little scent that Cissy Thomas gave us, out of a bottle she had bought for 2d at the fair at home. "This," I said, "will be acorn oil, scented acorn oil." "Will it?" said Harry, doubtfully. "Yes," I replied, adding confidently, "and there is nothing better for the hair." But we never had a chance of even seeing whether acorns and water would turn to oil, a miracle which I entirely believed in. The dinner bell rang, and I only had time hastily to conceal the doll's bath at the back of the cupboard where Miss kept her dresses. That was Saturday. Next day we found that Miss best dress, the blue silk with the Bismarck brown gimp, had slipped from its peg and fallen onto the doll's bath. The dress was ruined, and when Harry Martin and I owned up, as in honour bound, Miss Fairfield was away in London. We were deprived of dinner and had a long psalm to learn. I don't know whether punishment affects the hair, but I thought, next morning at prayers, that Harry's toe crop looked more like bay than ever. My hands were more compromising to me than anyone would have believed who had ever seen their size, for in the winter especially they were never clean. I can see now the little willow-patterned basin of hard, cold water, and smell the unpleasant little square of mottled soap with which I was expected to wash them. I don't know how the others managed, but for me the result was always the same: failure. And when I presented myself at breakfast, trying to hide my red and grubby little paws in my pinafore, Miss used to say, "Show your hands, Daisy. Yes, as I thought, not fit to sit down with young ladies and gentlemen. breakfast in the schoolroom for Miss Daisy." Then Miss Daisy would shiveringly betake herself to the cold, bare schoolroom, where the fire had but just been kindled. I used to sit cowering over the damp sticks with my white mug. Mauve-spotted it was, I remember, and had a brown crack near the handle, on a chair beside me. Sometimes I used to pull a twig from the fire, harpoon my bread and butter with it, and hold it to the fire. The warm, pale, greasy result I called toast. All this happened when Miss Fairfield was laid up with bronchitis. It was at that time, too, that my battle with compound long division began. Now I was not, I think, a very dull child, and always had an indignant sense that I could do sums well enough if anyone would tell me what they meant. But no one did, and day after day the long division sums, hopelessly wrong, disfigured my slate, and were washed off with my tears. Day after day I was sent to bed, my dinner was knocked off, or my breakfast, or my tea. I should literally have starved, I do believe, but for dear Mrs. Fairfield. She kept my little body going with illicit cakes and plums and the like, and fed my starving little heart with surreptitious kisses and kind words. She would lie in wait for me as I passed down the hall, and in a whisper call me into the store closet. It had a mingled and delicious smell of pickles and tea and oranges and jam, and the one taper Mrs. Fairfield carried only lighted dimly the delightful mystery of its well-filled shelves. Mrs. Fairfield used to give me a great lump of cake, or a broad slice of bread and jam, and lock me into the dark cupboard till it was eaten. I never taste black-currant jam now without a strong memory of the dark hole of happiness, where I used to wait, my sticky fingers held well away from my pinafore, till Mrs. Fairfield's heavy step and jingling keys came to release me. Then she would sponge my hands and face, and send me away clean, replete, and with a better heart for the eternal conflict with long division. I fancy that when Miss Fairfield came downstairs again, she changed the field of my arithmetical studies, for during the spring I seem to remember a blessed respite from my troubles. It is true that Miss was away, staying with friends. I was very popular at school that term, I remember, for I had learned to make dolls' bedsteads out of matchboxes during the holidays, and my eldest sister's Christmas present provided me with magnificent hangings for the same. Imagine a vivid green silk sash, with brilliant butterflies embroidered all over it in coloured silk and gold thread. A long sash, too, from which one could well spare a few inches at a time for upholstery. I acquired many marbles, and much gingerbread, and totally eclipsed Cissy Thomas, who had enjoyed the fleeting sunshine of popular favour on the insecure basis of paper dolls. Over my memory of this term no long division cast its hateful shade, and the scolding my dear mother gave me when she saw my sash's fair proportions docked to a waistband and a hard knot, with two brief and irregular ends, was so gentle that I endured it with fortitude, and considered my 10 weeks of popularity cheaply bought. I went back to school in high spirits, with a new set of sashes, and some magnificent pieces of silk and lace from my mother's lavendered wardrobe. But no one wanted dolls' beds any more, and Cissy Thomas had brought back a herbarium, the others all became botanists, and I, after a faint effort to emulate their successes, fell back on my garden. The seeds I had set in the spring had had a rest during the Easter holidays, and were already sprouting greenly, but alas, I never saw them flower. Long division set in again. Again, day after day, I sat lonely in the schoolroom, now like a furnace, and ate my dry bread and milk and water in the depths of disgrace, with the faux commencements and those revolting sums staring at me from my tear-blotted slate. Night after night I cried myself to sleep in my bed, whose coarse homespun sheets were hotter than blankets, because I could not get the answers right. Even Miss Fairfield, I fancied, began to look coldly on me, and the other children naturally did not care to associate with one so deficient in arithmetic. One evening, as I was sitting, as usual, sucking the smooth, dark slate pencil, and grieving over my troubles with the heartbroken misery of a child to whom the present grief looks eternal, I heard a carriage drive up to the door. Our schoolroom was at the back, and I was too much interested in a visitor, especially one who came at that hour, and in a carriage, to be able to bear the suspense of that silent schoolroom, so I cautiously opened its door and crept on hands and knees across the passage and looked down through the banisters. They were opening the door. It was a lady, and Mrs. Fairfield came out of the dining-room to meet her. It was a lady in a black moire antique dress and paisley shawl of the then mode. It was a lady whose face I could not see, because her back was to the red sunset light. But at that moment she spoke, and the next I was clinging round the mousse skirts, with my head buried in the paisley shawl. The world, all upside down, had suddenly righted itself. I, who had faced it alone, now looked out at it from the secure shelter of a moire screen, for my mother had come to see me. I did not cry myself to sleep that night, because my head lay on her arm. But even then I could not express how wretched I had been. Only when I heard that my mother was going to the south of France with my sisters, I clung about her neck, and with such insistence implored her not to leave me, not to go without me, that I think I must have expressed my trouble without uttering it. For when, after 3 delicious days of drives and walks, in which I always had a loving hand to hold, my mother left Stamford, she took me, trembling with joy like a prisoner reprieved, with her. And I have never seen, or wished to see, Stamford again. End of Part 2. Part 3. South with the Swallows. With what delicious thrills of anticipation and excitement I packed my doll's clothes on the eve of our journey. I had a little tin trunk with a real padlock. I have it still, by the way, only now it holds old letters and a bunch of violets, and a few other little worthless things that I do not often have the courage to look at nowadays. It is battered now, and the paint is worn off, but then it was fresh and shiny, and I packed all the doll's clothes in it with a light heart. I don't remember anything about our leaving home, or saying good-bye to the boys, so I fancy that they must have gone back to school some time before. But I remember the night passage from Newhaven to Dieppe far too vividly to care to describe it. I was a very worn-out little girl indeed when we reached Rouen, and I lay for the first time in a little white French bed. My mind was, I suppose, a little upset by my soul's sorrows at Stamford, and my body's unspeakable discomforts on board the Channel boat, and I was seized with a horror of the words débit de tabac, which I had noticed on our way from the station. I associated them with the gravestone of my father. I don't know why. I can only conjecture that the last syllable of débit, being the same as that of our name, may have had something to do with it. I lay awake in the dark. The light from the oil lamp in the street came through the persienne and fell in bright bars on the wall. As I grew drowsier, I seemed to read there in letters of fire, débit de tabac. Then I fell asleep, and dreamed that my father's ghost came to me, and implored me to have the horrible French inscription erased from his tomb, for I was an Englishman, he said. Then I woke, rigid with terror, and finally summoned courage to creep across the corridor to my mother's room and seek refuge in her arms. I am particular to mention this dream, because it is the first remembrance I have of any terror of the dead or of the supernatural. I do not at all know how it had its rise, perhaps in the chatter of some nursemaid long forgotten. By and by I should like to tell you about some of the things that used to frighten me when I was a child, but just now we are at Rouen, where Joan of Arc was burned, and where the church of St. Ouen is. Even then the beauty of that marvellous Gothic church filled me with a delight none the less intense for being incomprehensible to me. We went too to St. Catherine de Mont. The ceiling of the church was blue with gold stars. I thought it very beautiful. It was very windy on the mount, I remember, and the sky outside was blue like the church ceiling, with white clouds instead of gold stars. There was a stall a little way down the hill, where a white-coifed woman sold crucifixes and medals and rosaries and pictures. My mother bought me a little painting of the church in an alabaster frame. It was for a long time one of my chief treasures. We went on to Paris. It was very hot and very dusty. It was the exhibition year. I went to the exhibition, which seemed to me large, empty, and very tiring. I saw the Emperor and the pretty Empress driving in a carriage with their little son. The boy was about my own age, and wore a velvet suit and an embroidered frilly collar. The crowd cheered them with wild enthusiasm. 3 years later... But this is not a history paper. The pleasantest part of our stay in Paris was the time that my cousin Fred spent with us. He lived in Paris and knew that little girls like sweeties. Also he sang the comic songs of the day, Kafoozleum, and It's Really Very Unpleasant, and taught me their long and dreary words. He was very kind to me, and I remember him with tenderness, though I have never seen him since. On the whole, though I had a real silver daisy brooch bought at the exhibition, and more toys than could conveniently be carried in my tin trunk, I was glad to get away from Paris. As this is not a guide-book, I suppose I must not tell you about Tours and the convent of Marmoutier. I expected a convent to be a dark and terrible place, with perhaps a nun or two being built into the wall, and I was relieved to find a trim, well-kept garden and a pleasant house, where kindly-faced women in black gowns and white gimps walked about breviary in hand. Nor must I linger at Poitiers, where we saw gloves made, and I, to my intense delight, was measured for a small pair of bright blue kid. I liked Poitiers, especially the old Byzantine church now used as a stable. I picked up a bone there and treasured it for months. It was human, I was convinced, and I wove many romances round the little brown relic, romances that considerably embittered the reality when I came to know it. "What's that?" Alfred asked, picking the bone from its resting place in cotton wool in my corner drawer months afterwards. "A human bone," I said gravely. Alfred roared with aggravating laughter. "It's only half a fowl's back, you little silly." Ashamed and confused, I flung the bone into the inmost recesses of the drawer and assured him that he was mistaken. But he wasn't. We went from Poitiers to Angoulême. How often in school I have got into trouble for tracing that route on the map of France, when I should have been tracing Cap Gris-Nez or the course of the Rhône. And so, by easy stages, we reached Bordeaux. Bordeaux was en fête. The great annual fair was in progress. The big marketplace was covered with booths filled with the most fascinating objects. I was very happy at Bordeaux until it occurred to someone to take me to see the mummies. After that, farewell the tranquil mind, farewell content. And here I cannot resist the temptation to put a long parenthesis in my traveller's tale, and to write a little about what used to frighten me when I was little. And then I shall tell you about my first experience of learning French. End of Part 3. Part 4. In the Dark. How can I write of it, sitting here in the shifting shade of the lime trees, with the sunny daisied grass stretching away to the border, where the hollyhocks and lilies and columbines are, my ears filled with the soft swish-swish of the gardener's scythe at the other end of the garden, and the merry little voices of the children away in the meadow. Only by shutting my eyes and ears to the sweet sounds and sights of summer and the sun can I recall at all for you the dead silences, the frozen terrors of the long dark nights when I was little and lonely and very, very much afraid. The first thing I remember that frightened me was running into my father's dressing room and finding him playing at wild beasts with my brothers. He wore his great fur travelling coat inside out, and his roars were completely convincing. I was borne away screaming, and dreamed of wild beasts for many a long night afterwards. Then came some nursery charades. I was the high-born orphan, whom gypsies were to steal, and my part was to lie in a cradle, and, at the proper moment, to be carried away shrieking. I understood my part perfectly. I was about 3, I suppose, and had rehearsed it more than once. Being carried off in the arms of the gypsy, my favourite sister, was nothing to scream at, I thought, but she told me to scream, and I did it. Unfortunately, however, there had been no dress rehearsals, and when, on the night of the performance, the high-born orphan found itself close to a big black bonnet and a hideous mask, it did scream to some purpose, and presently screaming itself into some sort of fit or swoon, was put to bed, and stayed there for many days, which passed dreamlike. But that old woman haunted my dreams for years, haunts them still, indeed. I tell you, I come across her in my dreams to this day. She bends over me, and puts her face close to mine, and I wake with a spasm of agonized terror. Only now it is not horrible to me to waken in the dark. I draw a few long breaths, and as soon as my heart beats a little less wildly, I fall asleep again. But a child who wakes from an ugly dream does not fall asleep so quickly. For, to a child who is frightened, the darkness and the silence of its lonely room are only a shade less terrible than the wild horrors of dreamland. One used to lie awake in the silence, listening to the pad-pad of one's heart, straining one's ears to make sure that it was not the pad-pad of something else, something unspeakable, creeping towards one out of the horrible, dense dark. One used to lie quite still, I remember, listening. And when my nurse came to bed and tucked me up, she used to find my pillow wet, and say to the under-nurse, "Weakness, you know, the precious poppet doesn't seem to get any stronger." But my pillow was not wet with tears of weakness. These were the dews of agony and terror. My nurse, Ah, how good she was to me. Never went downstairs to supper after she found out my terrors, which she very quickly did. She used to sit in the day nursery with the door open a tiny crack, and that light was company, because I knew I had only to call out, and someone who loved me would come in and banish fear. But a light without human companionship was worse than darkness, especially a little light. Night lights, deepening the shadows with their horrid possibilities, are a mere refinement of cruelty, and some friends, who thought to do me a kindness by leaving the gas burning low, gave me one of the most awful nights I ever had. It was a strange house in Sutherland Gardens, a house with large rooms and heavy hangings, with massive wardrobes and deep ottoman boxes. The immense four-post beds stood out about a yard from the wall, for some convenience of sweeping reason, I believe. Consider the horror of having behind you, as you lay trembling in the chill linen of a strange bed, a dark space, no comforting solid wall that you could put your hand up to and touch, but a dark space from which, even now, in the black silence, something might be stealthily creeping, something which would presently lean over you in the dark, whose touch you would feel, not knowing whether it were the old woman in the mask or some new terror. That was the torture of the first night. The next, I begged that the gas might be left full on. It was, and I fell asleep in comparative security. But while I slept came some thrifty soul, and finding the gas burning to waste, turned it down. Not out, down. I awoke in a faint light, and presently sat up in bed to see where it came from, and this is what I saw. A corpse laid out under white draperies, and at its foot a skeleton with luminous skull and outstretched bony arm. I knew, somewhere far away and deep down, my reason knew, that the dead body was a white dress laid on a long ottoman, that the skull was the opal globe of the gas, and the arm the pipe of the gas bracket. But that was not reason's hour. Imagination held sway, and her poor little victim, who was 10 years old then, and ought to have known better, sat up in bed, hour after hour, with the shadowy void behind her, the dark curtains on each side, and in front that horror. Next day I went home, which was perhaps a good thing for my brain. When my father was alive, we lived in a big house in Kennington Lane, where he taught young men agriculture and chemistry. My father had a big meadow and garden, and had a sort of small farm there. Fancy a farm in Kennington! Among the increase that blessed his shed was a two-headed calf. The head and shoulders of this were stuffed, and inspired me with a terror which my brothers increased by pursuing me with a terrible object. But one of my father's pupils, to whom I owe that and many other kindnesses, one day seized me under one arm, and the two-headed horror under the other, and thus equipped we pursued my brothers. They fled shrieking, and I never feared it again. In a dank, stone-flagged room, where the boots were blacked, and the more unwieldy chemicals housed, there was nailed on the wall the black skin of an emu. That skin, with its wiry black skin to me, that fluttered dismally in the draught, was no mere bird's skin to me. It hated me, it wished me ill. It was always lurking for me in the dark, ready to rush out at me. It was waiting for me at the top of the flight, while the old woman with the mask stretched skinny hands out to grasp my little legs as I went up the nursery stairs. I never passed the skin without covering my eyes with my hands. From this terror that walked by night, I was delivered by Mr. Cairns, now public analyst for Sheffield. He took me on his shoulder, where I felt quite safe, reluctant but not resisting, to within a couple of yards of the emu. "Now," he said, "will you do what I tell you?" "Not any nearer," I said evasively. "Now you know I won't let it hurt you?" "Yes." "Then will you stroke it?" I didn't want to. "To please me?" That argument was conclusive, for I loved him. Then we approached the black feathers, I clinging desperately to his neck and sobbing convulsively. "No, no, no, not any nearer!" But he was kind and wise and insisted. His big hand smoothed down the feathers. "Now, Daisy, you know you promised. Give me your hand." I shut my eyes tight and let him draw my hand down the dusty feathers. Then I opened my eyes a little bit. "Now you stroke it. Stroke the poor emu." I did so. "Are you afraid now?" Curiously enough, I wasn't. Poor Mr. Cairns paid dearly for his kindness. For several weeks I gave him no peace, but insisted on being taken, at all hours of the day and night, to stroke the poor emu. So proud is one of a new courage. After we left Kennington, I seemed to have had a period of more ordinary terrors, of dreams from which to awaken was mere relief, not a horror scarcely less than that of the dream itself. I dreamed of cows and dogs, of falling houses and crumbling precipices. It was not till that night at Rouen that the old horror of the dark came back, deepened by superstitious dread. But all this time I have not told you about the mummies at Bordeaux, and now there is no room for them here. They must go into the next chapter. End of Part 4. Part 5. The Mummies at Bordeaux. It was because I was tired of churches and picture galleries, of fairs and markets, of the strange babble of foreign tongues and the thin English of the guide-book, that I begged so hard to be taken to see the mummies. To me, the name of a mummy was as a friend's name. As one Englishman travelling across a desert seeks to find another of whom he has heard in that far land, so I sought to meet these mummies who had cousins at home, in the British Museum, in dear, dear England. My fancy did not paint mummies for me, apart from plate-glass cases, camphor, boarded galleries, and kindly curators, and I longed to see them as I longed to see home, and to hear my own tongue spoken about me. I was consumed by a fever of impatience for the 3 days which had to go by before the coming of the day on which the treasures might be visited. My sisters, who were to lead me to these delights, believed too that the mummies would be chiefly interesting on account of their association with Bloomsbury. Well, we went. I in my best blue silk frock, which I insisted on wearing to honour the occasion, holding the hand of my sister, and positively skipping with delicious anticipation. There was some delay about keys, during which my excitement was scarcely to be restrained. Then we went through an arched doorway, and along a flagged passage, the old man who guided us explaining volubly in French as we went. What does he say? He says they are natural mummies. What does that mean? They are not embalmed by man, like the Egyptian ones, but simply by the peculiar earth of the churchyard where they were buried. The words did not touch my conception of the glass cases and their good-natured guardian. the passage began to slope downward. A chill air breathed on our faces, bringing with it a damp, earthy smell. Then we came to some narrow stone steps. Our guide spoke again. "What does he say?" "We are to be careful. The steps are slippery and mouldy." I think even then my expectation still was of a long, clean gallery filled with the white light of a London noon, shed through high skylights on Egyptian treasures. But the stairs were dark, and I held my sister's hand tightly. Down we went, down, down. "What does he say?" "We are under the church now. These are the vaults." We went along another passage, the damp, mouldy smell increasing, and the clasp of my sister's hand grew closer and closer. We stopped in front of a heavy door barred with iron, and our guide turned a big reluctant key in a lock that grated. "Le voilà," he said, throwing open the door and drawing back dramatically. We were in the room before my sisters had time to see cause for regretting that they had brought me. The vision of dry boards and white light and glass cases vanished, and in its stead I saw this. A small vault, as my memory serves me, about 15 feet square, with an arched roof, from the centre of which hung a lamp that burned with a faint blue light, and made the guide's candle look red and lurid. The floor was flagged like the passages, and was as damp and chill. Round 3 sides of the room ran a railing, and behind it, standing against the wall, with a ghastly look of life in death, were about 200 skeletons. Not white clean skeletons hung on wires, like the one you see at the doctor's, but skeletons with the flesh hardened on their bones, with their long dry hair hanging each side of their brown faces, where the skin in drying had drawn itself back from their gleaming teeth and empty eye sockets. Skeletons draped in mouldering shreds of shrouds and grave clothes, their lean fingers still clothed with dry skin seemed to reach out towards me. There they stood, men, women, and children, knee-deep in loose bones collected from the other vaults of the church and heaped round them. On the wall, near the door, I saw the dried body of a little child hung up by its hair. I don't think I screamed, or cried, or even said a word. I think I was paralysed with horror, but I remember presently going back up those stairs, holding tightly to that kindly hand, and not daring to turn my head, lest one of those charnel house faces should peep out at me from some niche in the damp wall. It must have been late afternoon, and in the hurry of dressing for the table d'hôte, my stupor of fright must have passed unnoticed, for the next thing I remember is being alone in a large room, waiting as usual for my supper to be sent up. For my mother did not approve of late dinners for little people, and I was accustomed to have bread and milk alone, while she and my sisters dined. It was a large room, and very imperfectly lighted by the 2 wax candles in silver candlesticks. There were 2 windows and a curtained alcove, where the beds were. Suddenly my blood ran cold. What was behind that curtain? Beds. Yes, whispered something that was I, and yet not I. But suppose there are no beds there now, only mummies, mummies, mummies. A sudden noise. I screamed with terror. It was only the door opening to let the waiter in. He was a young waiter, hardly more than a boy, and had always smiled kindly at me when we met, though hitherto our intercourse had not gone farther. Now I rushed to him and flung my arms round him, to his immense amazement, and the near ruin of my bread and milk. He spoke no English, and I no French, but somehow he managed to understand that I was afraid, and afraid of that curtained alcove. He set down the bread and milk, and he took me in his arms, and together we fetched more candles, and then he drew back the awful curtain, and showed me the beds lying white and quiet. If I could have spoken French, I should have said, "Yes, but how do I know it was all like that just now, before you drew the curtain back?" As it was, I said nothing, only clung to his neck. I hope he did not get into any trouble that night for neglected duties, for he did not attempt to leave me until my mother came back. He sat down with me on his knee, and petted me and sang to me under his breath, and fed me with the bread and milk, when, by and by, I grew calm enough to take it. All good things be with him wherever he is. I like best to think of him in a little hotel of his own, a quiet little country inn standing back from a straight road, bordered with apple trees and poplars. There are wooden benches outside the door, and within a whitewashed kitchen where a plump, rosy-faced woman is busy with many cares, never busy enough, however, to pass the master of the house without a loving word or a loving look. I like to believe that now he has little children of his own, who hold out their arms when he opens the door, and who climb upon his knees clamouring for those same songs which he sang, out of the kindness of his boyish heart, to the little frightened English child such a long, long time ago. The mummies of Bordeaux were the crowning horror of my childish life. It is to them, I think, more than to any other thing, that I owe nights and nights of anguish and horror, long years of bitterest fear and dread. All the other fears could have been effaced, but the shock of that sight branded it on my brain, and I never forgot it. For many years I could not bring myself to go about any house in the dark, and long after I was a grown woman I was tortured, in the dark watches, by imagination and memory, who rose strong and united, overpowering my will and my reason as utterly as in my baby days. It was not till I had 2 little children of my own that I was able to conquer this mortal terror of darkness, and teach imagination her place under the foot of reason and the will. My children, I resolved, should never know such fear, and to guard them from it I must banish it from my own soul. It was not easy, but it was done. It is banished now, and my babies, thank God, have never known it. It was a dark cloud that overshadowed my childhood, and I don't believe my mother ever knew how dark it was, for I could not tell anyone the full horror of it while it was over me, and when it had passed, I came from it, as one who has lived long years in an enchanter's castle, where the sun is darkened always, might come forth into the splendour of noontide. Such a one breathes God's sweet air, and beholds the free heavens with joyous leaps of the heart, but he does not speak soon nor lightly of what befell in the dark, in the evil days, in the castle of the enchanter. End of Part 5. Part 6. She was the most beautiful person in the world. She had brown eyes and pink cheeks, a blue silk dress, and a white bonnet with orange blossoms in it. She had 2 pairs of shoes, and 2 pairs of stockings, and she had 2 wigs, a brown and a flaxen one. All her clothes took off and on, and there was a complete change of them. I saw her first at a bazaar, and longed to possess her, but her price was 2 guineas, and no hope mingled with my longing. Here let me make a confession. I had never really loved a doll. My affections up to that time had been lavished on a black and white spotted penny rabbit, bought at a Kentish fair. But when I saw Renee, it seemed to me that if I could love a doll, this would be the one. We were at Pau then, in a select boarding house. I was bored with travel, as I believe all children are. So large a part of a child's life is made up of little familiar playthings and objects. It has little of that historic and artistic sense which lends colour and delight to travel. I was tired of wandering about, and glad to think we were to stay in Pau for the winter. The bazaar pleased me. It was got up by the English residents, and their fancy work was the fancy work of the church bazaars in England, and I felt at home among it. And when my eyes rested on Renee, I saw the most delightful object I had seen for many weeks. I looked and longed, and longed and looked. And then suddenly, in a moment, one of the great good fortunes of my life happened to me. The beautiful doll was put up to be raffled, and my sister won her. I trembled with joy as she and her wardrobe were put into my hands. I took her home. I dressed and undressed her 20 times a day. I made her play the part of heroine in all my favourite stories. I told her fairy tales and took her to bed with me at night for company. But I never loved her. I have never been able to love a doll in my life. My mother came to me the next day as I was changing Renee's wig, and said, "Don't you think it's almost time that you began to have some lessons again? I don't want my little girl to grow up quite ignorant. You wouldn't like that yourself, would you?" "I don't know," I said doubtfully, feeling that ignorance in a grown-up state was surely to be preferred to a return to Stamford and long division. "I am not going to send you to school," my mother hastened to add, doubtless seeing the clouds that gathered in my face. "I know a French lady here who has a little girl about your age, and she says that you can go and live with her for a little while and learn French." "Is she a nice little girl?" I asked. "What is she like?" "Well, she's rather like your new doll," my mother laughed, "when it has the flaxen wig on. Think how nice it will be to write letters home in French." I knew Miss could not write letters in French, and the prospect of crushing her with my new literary attainment filled my wicked little heart. "I should like to go and live with a little girl who is like my new dolly," I said, "if you will come and see me every day." So I went, my doll's clothes packed in their little tin trunk. And I stood stealing shy side glances at Marguerite, who was certainly very like my doll, while my mother and her mother were exchanging last civilities. I was so pleased with the new surroundings, the very French interior, the excitement of being received as a member by a real French family, that I forgot to cry till the wheels of my mother's carriage had rolled away from the door. Then I was left, a little English child, without a word of French, in the bosom of a French family, and as this came upon me I burst into a flood of tears. Madame Lourdes could speak no English, but she knew the universal language, the language of love and kindness. She drew me to her ample lap, wiped my eyes, smiled at me, and chattered volubly in her own tongue, words whose sense was dead to me, but whose tone breathed of tenderness and sympathy. By the time Mademoiselle Lourdes, the only English-speaking member of the family, came home from her daily round of teaching, Marguerite and I were unpacking my doll's clothes together, and were laughing at our vain efforts to understand each other. I learned French in 3 months. All day I was with Madame Lourdes or Marguerite, neither of whom knew a word of English. It was French or silence, and any healthy child would have chosen French as I did. They were 3 happy months. I adored Marguerite, who was, I think, the typical good child of the French storybooks. She wore her hair in a little yellow plait down her back. I do not think we ever got into wilful mischief. For instance, our starving the cat was quite unintentional. We were playing bandits in a sort of cellar that opened from the triangular courtyard in front of the house, and it occurred to us that Mimi would make an excellent captive princess, so we caught her and put her in a hamper at the end of the cellar, and when my mother called to take us home to tea with her, we rushed off and left the poor princess still a prisoner. If we hadn't been out that evening, we must have been reminded of her existence by the search for her, but Madame Lord, failing to find the cat, concluded that she must have run away, or met with an accident, and did not mention the matter to us out of consideration for our feelings, so that it was not until 2 nights later that I started up in bed about midnight and pulled Marguerite's yellow pigtail wildly. "Oh, Marguerite!" I cried. "Poor Mimi!" I had to pull at the pigtail as though it was a bell rope, and I had pulled 3 times before I could get Marguerite to understand what was the matter with me. Then she sat up in bed, rigid with a great purpose. "We must go down and fetch her," she said. It was winter. The snow was on the ground. Marguerite thoughtfully put on her shoes and her dressing gown, but I, with some vague recollection of barefooted pilgrims, and some wild desire to make expiation for my crime, went down barefooted in my nightgown. The crime of forgetting a cat for 3 days was well paid for by that expedition. We crept through the house like little shivering mice, across the courtyard thinly sprinkled with snow, and into that awful black yawning cellar where nameless horrors lurked behind each bit of shapeless lumber, ready to leap out upon us as we passed. Marguerite did not share my terrors. She only remarked that it was very cold and that we must make haste. We opened the hamper, fully expecting to find the captive dead, and my heart gave a leap of delight when, as we raised the lid, the large white Mimi crept out and began to rub herself against us with joyous purrings. I remember so well the feeling of her soft, warm fur against my cold little legs. I caught the cat in my arms, and as I turned to go back to the house, my half-frozen foot struck against something on the floor. It felt silky. I picked it up. It was Renée. She had also been a captive princess in our game of bandits. She also had been shut up here all this time, and I had never missed her. We took the cat and the doll back to bed with us, and tried to get warm again. Marguerite was soon asleep, but I lay awake for a long time, kissing and crying over the ill-used cat. I didn't get up again for a fortnight. My barefooted pilgrimage cost me a frightful cold, and the loss of several children's parties to which we had been invited. Marguerite, throughout my illness, behaved like an angel. I only remember one occasion on which I quarrelled with her. It was on the subject of dress. We were going to a children's party, and my best blue silk was put out for me to wear. "I wish you wouldn't wear that," said Marguerite hesitatingly. "It makes my grey cashmere look so old." Now I had nothing else to wear but a brown frock which I hated. "Never mind," I said hypocritically. "It's better to be good than smart. Everybody says so." And I put on my blue silk. When I was dressed, I pranced off to the kitchen to show my finery to the cook, and under her admiring eyes executed my best curtsy. It began, of course, by drawing the right foot back. It ended in a tub of clothes and water that was standing just behind me. I floundered out somehow, and my first thought was how funny I must have looked, and in another moment I should have burst out laughing. But as I scrambled out, I saw Marguerite in the doorway smiling triumphantly, and heard her thin little voice say, The blue silk can't mock the poor grey cashmere now." An impulse of blind fury came upon me. I caught Marguerite by her little shoulders, and before the cook could interfere, I had ducked her head first into the tub of linen. Madame Lourdes behaved beautifully. She appeared on the scene at this moment, and, impartial as ever, she slapped us both. But when she heard from the cook the rights of the story, my sentence was bed. "But Marguerite," said her mother, "has been punished enough for an unkind word." And Marguerite was indeed sobbing bitterly, while I was dry-eyed and still furious. "She can't go," I cried. "She hasn't got a dress." "You have spoiled her dress," said Madame Lourdes coolly. "The least you can do is to lend her your brown one." And that excellent woman actually had the courage to send her own daughter to a party in my dress, an exquisite punishment to us both. Marguerite came to my bedside that night. She had taken off the brown dress and wore her little flannel dressing-gown. "You're not cross now, are you?" she said. "I did beg mother to let you come, and I've not enjoyed myself a bit, and I've brought you this from the party." It was a beautiful little model of a coffee-mill made in sugar. My resentment could not withstand this peace-offering. I never quarrelled with Marguerite again, and when my mother sent for me to join her at Bagnères, I wept as bitterly at leaving Madame Lourdes as I had done at being left with her. "Cheer up, my darling, my cabbage," said the dear woman, as the tears stood in her own little grey eyes. "I have an instinct, a presentiment, which tells me we shall meet again." But we never have. End of Part 6.